We turn now to learning outcomes. This topic fits into our sequence in this way. You know we looked at the needs for translator training or translator education, then how that's been analyzed in terms of competences or skills. Now those competence skills are turned into learning objectives or learning outcomes. We'll come to the difference in a minute. And that then leads to what you actually do on the different levels of training. Again, the terminology is not as precise as one might like it to be, but there are some fairly common distinctions that we should observe. Now, for this lesson, you'll see that there are two readings. One is the chapter from Kelly, and the other is a document produced by the University of Melbourne that tells us all, that is, all their teaching staff in theory, how to write learning outcomes. Now, both of these concord on a basic distinction between what we might call learning objectives, that's the aims of your teaching, what you're going to do, the sort of stuff that comes directly from the needs analysis, and then learning outcomes, which should have the form in Kelly here, by the end of the course, that is the master, by the end of the subject, or by the end of the lesson, you or the student will be able to ... and you have the things you'll be able to do, or you'll be able to know, I think. In Kelly, this is very much an extension of competences. You'll see the chapter there discusses competence theories and skills, and then blends that right into the analysis of learning outcomes. In Papanichi Miller, the document we have from the University of Melbourne, they're very much on learning outcomes as such and how to write them. And I think this is because in translation studies, we've had a lot more discussion of competences than in other fields, and people still talk about competences, where in other fields they have moved on to other things. I think I just point that out so that we're aware of a certain specificity of translation or translator training in this regard. Now, I turn to Papanichi Miller, the document we have from our Faculty of Education. They make it very clear that there's a difference between aims or goals, what you want to achieve with a particular master course or subject, or even lesson, and then the learning objectives, which are the teacher's intentions for students. So I put up the top here what might be aims or goals, and I'm being perhaps critical here, but we do have meetings where we discuss strategy for the future of our schools or our faculty, and the criteria for those discussions are things like maintaining levels of student enrollment, increasing prestige of the university, rankings are important at that level, maximizing profits, which should mean not making a loss, but this university likes to make profits. And a lot of attention is paid to student satisfaction scores. So that's a criterion. So the aims or goals at that level are things like keeping students happy, keeping them enrolled, advancing the prestige. Employment is generally not discussed there, but it comes in as part of prestige in many fields. That is, people get prestigious jobs, and that reflects positively on the standing of the university. Learning objectives, though, are quite different. In this subject, students will be taught A, B, and C. This is the aims of the teachers for the students. Okay? And that's where the competences come in. I'm going to deal with that competence, and that competence. Okay? Learning outcomes, though, as we said, and as we found in Kelly, are of the form, by the end of the course, by the end of the subject, students will be able to, and then a whole lot of things can follow. And it's not difficult to find things. Just go to the handbook for any subject or any course that we have available, and you will find how people have generated statements like that. Remarkably, with the recent transition to the Canvas online learning tool, the format of Canvas asks us to write the learning outcomes at the beginning of each lesson. So you should find a page, I know you never look at it, but there should be a page there which gives just one or two sentences on the outcomes of a particular lesson. Within faculties of education, there has been a lot of attention to the way outcomes are written. And this goes back to the work of Bloom in the 1950s. It's been around for a long time. Bloom worked initially on cognitive measures or types of outcomes, but then later incorporated affective measures, how people feel about it, or what kinds of interpersonal skills are developed, and psychomotor skills of what you can actually do when you're, for example, typing or working on a text physically, or using software, for example. Now, the focus here has been on the verbs. What kinds of verbs? By the end of the lesson, students will be able to, and that to needs an infinitive. And Bloom, for example, developed a whole lot of verbs. Now, Kelly gives this summary of Bloom. If you're talking about evaluation, students will be able to judge what a good translation is. We'll be able to appraise the work of a translator. We'll be able to evaluate the importance of the mistakes. We'll be able to compare two translations in terms of quality. We'll be able to assess the performance of a translator. Okay, it's quite easy to use all these verbs in that format, but look how many verbs are there available. It can become quite confusing, and you have to really think about what level your lesson is focused on and what kinds of verbs are appropriate. It's not easy to sort out exactly what you want to do in a lesson. I'm talking about lesson level because that's what we're going to move on to next. It gets worse in Popenici and Millar. Here for knowledge, which is recalling facts, you've got all those verbs. And then comprehension, the capacity to see and understand relationships, all those verbs. And then there are many more. It's difficult. It becomes complex. And I don't think it has to be quite that complex, as you'll see in a minute. It's interesting, if you like, to go into the handbook, pick up a subject from our Master of Applied Linguistics or our Master of Translation, and look at the verbs used in the learning outcomes. Then go to our Faculty of Education, pick a similar subject, go there and look at the verbs they use. In theory, the educationalist should use many more different verbs than people outside of education, but I'll let you explore that for yourselves. How many learning outcomes should you write? Kelly recommends 5, 6, no more than 7 or 8, so it's pretty general, for each level of planning. The recommendation really should be as few as possible so you can focus on what you're doing. If I'm going in to give a 2-hour session, which is lecture plus activity, I don't think I really want more than 2 or 3. And possibly just 1 would keep that lesson really well focused. However, if a master program has to serve various employment outlets, that people go on to different occupations, then you're going to get quite complex, and you might want to go up to the 7 or 8 that are recommended in Kelly. So the general recommendation, to speak like Grice, would be as few as possible and as many as necessary. Impeccable maxim of quantity. Before we go into the examples, I just want to discuss what's wrong with the idea of learning outcomes. And there have been many criticisms of the approach, and yet it continues. And in all the institutions I've been working in 4 different countries over the past 10 years, all of them require us to write learning outcomes. And so there must be something in it. But here's what's not in it. One might presume that the ability to translate is holistic. You're able to do many, many things on many different levels at the same time. That is, deal with text, deal with documentation, deal with interpersonal relationships, adapt to a different readership, communicate. It's a holistic thing where everything comes together. And yet when we write learning outcomes, we're forced to break it up into little bits, which in some sense might be a falsification of where we want to get to. Okay, that's the criticism. We'll see in a minute that there are ways of producing counter-arguments to that. We are obliged to write the outcomes before we ever see the students in front of us. So they're by definition not adjusted to individual differences or specific group differences. If I have a small class and they all want to work on something, some particular area, we can do it. But I can't do it in the learning outcomes because I've probably written those 2 years before I actually get into the class. So there's a planning problem. You gain in the clarity of the planning, but you lose in the capacity to respond to very local conditions and interests. That also means it's slow to adjust. For example, the noticeable qualitative improvement of machine translation since 2016 should oblige us to adjust our training to it. But it takes 2 years and often more for these things to go from planning to actual execution. So it's very, very hard to respond to what's happening in the market, or in a market that is as fast moving as translation is. And the big problem for me is that these things tend to be invented by a teacher or a group of teachers discussing things. Oh, yes, we should do this. Yes, we should do this. Yes, and in this order and like this, without any real reference to empirical evidence of where our students go, what kinds of things the students actually need when they get there. What does a translator really need in their job, or a project manager, or an interpreter, or anybody who's learning a foreign language, for example. Okay, so those are the things that we might think about when assessing the virtues of outcomes. Now, there are virtues. For example, because we have to put these things in the handbook, any student signing up for a subject or for a course will have a fair idea of what they're buying. Yeah, perhaps, I don't know, did you look at the outcomes before deciding on the master you're doing? Did you look at the outcomes before selecting a subject? Probably not. I think in the needs analysis, I asked that question, and the answers were more on the lines of sounds good, I heard it was good, I heard the teacher was good, or the teacher was bad. So I'm not too sure if students are actually communicated to on that level. However, they're there, the outcomes are there, and they're clear if you are deciding, for example, which particular master you want to do, or which subject. I've been at a conference where people actually in terminology were talking about how to write learning outcomes, and they wanted it very highly standardized, not just in the verbs, but in the noun phrases that follow the verbs. You know, you'll be able to assess what. And their idea was that if we standardized all the work, all the tasks in the language professions, then employers, when they're looking to employ somebody, could write a list of the things they need and give it particular weightings. And then students, when they leave, would have their scores for all these particular tasks. And so a computer program could match you with the ideal job for you. And employers would not have to interview and select candidates. They could put in their information and it would give them their ideal employment match. So they were thinking of using this kind of standardization for a kind of dating service for employment. And a lot can be done with that. Nevertheless, employers still want to interview people and talk with them to see what the person is like and not what the learning outcomes are like. So there's a certain humanist or humanistic resistance to the mechanization of those relationships. What is very good is that when you sit down to write the outcomes, you find it's difficult. You find, well, I'm doing all these different things and I don't know what's most important. Let me see what is most important. How will I arrange it? And that reflection in itself gives rise to self-criticism. You go back and you look at the student comments, or you remember where your students have gone and what kinds of jobs they're going into. And that can be a useful mental activity for the individual teacher or for a group of teachers discussing these things. This could be good or bad depending on how you are, but the degree of control is of some interest. Our institutions do want to control what we're doing. Why? I think they want to make sure they get value for their money. They do want to make sure that we deliver a quality product, and they have no way of knowing what quality is except by looking at the student assessments and relating them to the outcomes, to what was supposed to be achieved. Okay, so control can be a good thing. It also enables the institution, at the institutional level, to coordinate, in theory, what happens between different masters, like when there are overlaps between masters, or the same thing is being done in very different ways in two masters. Somebody could get back and look at the learning outcomes and say, the things being done in this subject are very similar to what's being done over here in this other masters. It could be an elective, and you would incorporate it into that. Or we could get back at a master and look at things being done doubled up unnecessarily in different subjects. So it does allow control and coordination on that level. For example, as some of you know, when I came in and started teaching here in 2017, the handbook had no translation technology mentioned. It was not among the outcomes. I think that was wrong, so what did I do? I taught translation technology. I taught post-editing, and I taught translation memories, just because it had to be done somewhere, and I don't care much about planning and control. Unfortunately, another teacher in the same master had the same idea, and he was doing translation memories there too. So there was a lack of coordination. The lack of coordination came from the learning objectives not stating what was actually being done. Now, if we'd had the capacity to write learning objectives quickly and get them in the handbook, a coordinator could stand back and see, something's wrong here. Translation memories are being done in two different places. There's no reason why that should happen. Let's get together and sort it out. Okay, so as an act of communication, writing learning outcomes can have its very serious virtues. On the same level of discussion and reflection, we are obliged to distinguish between objectives that are specific to the lesson or the course, in this case a master, and those that are transversal or general. And this is very important when we realize, as we increasingly do, that a lot of our graduates go into a wide range of occupations. So, for example, we train them in translation, but they finish up doing many other things with language. And to enable that to happen, we need a lot of what's called transversal learning objectives, things you learn when you're learning how to translate, that can be applied in other language tasks. And the place to do that is on the level of learning outcomes. Now, I want to finish this talk with an example. This is my own example. You can get learning outcomes in the handbook or in any university. There's no shortage of material to discuss or criticize here. I just want to go through one that I did when I planned a master, the whole master, and I had to go through the reflexive activity of writing learning outcomes. And you'll see that I'm perhaps not very good at it. First, I had to get my aims. My aims were this: one, to train students to enter the language industry with highly transferable skills. Because I know that for Spanish, English, people are doing many other things as well as translation. I just know this as a fact of the market because I worked at that market for many years. And the second aim comes from the nature of the master programs here. What do you call them? Programs? No, courses here. That we want part of it to enable research training for people who want to go on and do research. Okay, so that's institutionally necessary. I figured out my competences, but I call them skills. I said there are 5 areas I wanted to do it in. People have to know about professional translation and the profession, and that's actually where I do theory stuff, but it's more sociology and theory. They have to be able to process text and use technologies. They have to have skills in the workplace, teamwork, working together, project management, and time management especially. And then the 5th one was research skills, because the institution requires that. I think in other places I've set up a master program with just those first 4, because the aim was not to produce researchers, but I'm happy to include that if the institution wants it. Now, under each of those 5 heads, I then had to write learning outcomes. So by the end of the course, the student will be able to understand. Okay, this is knowledge. This is not things that they have to apply, but yeah, ethics has to be there to get the nutty endorsement. And the rest is fairly straightforward, and it's good for people to know that what sort of context they're working in. Text processing, though, is rather different. You'll see it's be able to, and just a couple of understands. And what I put in red are the outcomes that I think are transversal. I think that when you learn to translate or learn these things, you can apply to translation and many other things as well. And you'll notice that I've got to 8, which is Kelly's maximum allowed. But this is where the bulk of the training would be. And I think it should be taught in such a way that it is not just transversal, but also involves spoken and written translation at the same time. Just by not specifying, I allow a lot of it to be spoken. As for the use of technologies, we see it goes black there because there are technologies that are specific to translation. But the other ones, the ability to learn new technology efficiently, that's absolutely transversal. And that's actually the one that I work on the most, as some of you might have appreciated. Workplace skills, again, very, very transversal, because you're going to work in a workplace and you've got to know how to do that and how to manage people, relate to people, develop projects, participate in projects. So a lot of the training has to be in this part of the skills map as well. And the last one, career paths in translation. Yes, it's there because it's called translation. But if you can think about a career path in translation, you can also apply that to other fields as well. And then the research skills are entirely transversal. Okay, now you'll probably be aware that I don't use many different verbs, basically be able to and understand. And this one we could say be able to apply style sheets, okay? So I'm probably not very good at it. The educationalists would go back, I think, and rewrite those verbs to make it more pleasing to them. And here, for example, I've got 9. That's beyond the 8 maximum recommended by Kelly. But I thought there are a certain number of things there that we should be aware of and be able to emphasize. So we can bend the rules a little bit for good reason. How does that apply to subjects? Well, within the master I planned, we had a range of subjects. We had a lot of electives, actually, because the electives are very good at this university. I wrote them in such a way that they can apply to written and spoken translation, because that's one of the things I want to do in the master. And I wrote it in such a way that the transferable objectives were in the majority. Now, how this fits together is like this. When you've done that, you can put all your outcomes down there in that column. You put all your subjects up there in that column. And I can trace which outcomes are done where. So TP1, for example, is done across 4 subjects. And I have to coordinate those subjects in terms of that learning outcome. Whereas PT1, I think we've got that here. Yeah, we can see the same outcome is sought in different subjects. So we have to think about that, specify exactly what we're doing and perhaps coordinate that between them. PT2, there we go, we picked this one, says understand and apply codes of ethics and professional practice. Very good. That's done in the product, translation as product course, subject, okay, as a standalone lesson. Some of you have had that lesson. Some of you have know what the Ausit Nati Code of Ethics is. But then it's related to the internship, because in the report and the reflection on the internship, we want people to write about ethics. So the two are connected in a productive way. This is the theory, if you like, and this is the applied reflection on ethics. So we can do planning if we've got the learning outcomes written out explicitly and clearly. We can do this kind of map to see what's going on at the level of the entire master in this case. And then it becomes possible to map sequentiality. Should we do this first and this? As you can see, it's going more or less like that. That is, we should begin from the idea of translation and the industry and work through to research at the end. So much for learning objectives. They do indeed have their uses.